Good evening. So good to see you all. In many ways, this book, or at least in one way, this book was started 83 years ago when Stewart was born. And in another way, this book was started 40 years ago when John Markoff and Stewart met at the Hackers Conference. And it started a friendship where they traded things back and forth in Silicon Valley for those 40 years. And then, obviously more proximately, in the last 5 years, John was able to write down all that stuff for us in this book tonight and give us a short presentation on it tonight. And then we'll be talking about that. But John is a formidable journalist on technology and the stories behind technology for all of his career. And I know all of us were so happy to find that he was the one writing this book about Stewart.
So I have the dubious task tonight of introducing Stewart to the one audience in the world who completely does not need to be introduced to Stewart, which is kind of... but I did think it'd be fun to share with you just a few of my favorite documents. So this, by far, is my favorite. Stewart, as a young photographer in 1964, shares his portfolio with Ansel Adams. And I think that if I got this kind of an endorsement from Ansel Adams, I might have become a photographer. But Stewart was pulled in a lot of different directions, and so that's not the way it happened. Outdoor Life magazine published this in 1946, and Stewart, as a young boy, took this pledge shortly thereafter. All these years later, he can still recite this from memory, and I think this is the through line through Stewart's life that pulls all those disparate threads together. Stewart's parents, Arthur Bob Brand and Julia Morley Brand, if you want to understand where Stewart's coming from, you need to think about Higgins Lake, which was where a group of closely interconnected families summered together, the Brands, the Morleys, the Burrows, and the Bernards. And those interwoven families spent each summer in an encampment at Higgins Lake, and Stewart basically was able to have what he calls as a free-range childhood, and I think that better shapes him. This is the family home in Rockford. One of the first things Stewart told me is he thought he had an upper-class background. And clearly the families in Michigan, from Saginaw, were upper class. But in this case, I think it's much more nuanced. To my eyes, that home was a solidly middle-class home. And the family bought some property upstream on the Rock River, and the plan was to eventually build their own grand home, but that home was never built because the priorities of the Brand family were education. I think this is my favorite picture. This is a phone booth in his dormitory at Stanford in 1957. Down in the corner, you can see some resistors, which is how you got free phone calls. This was a community that was known as the phone freak community, which preceded the hackers community, and of course, Stewart was there. On a photo assignment, Stewart's favorite period in the military was his time spent as a photographer. Here's a meet and greet with John Kennedy. Stewart backpedaled furiously so Kennedy didn't shake his hand. He was supposed to be there talking to the wax. The man at the top of the photo is Jean Varda, a well-known collage artist in the Bay Area in the 50s and 60s, key to the beat community. And Stewart had discovered the beat community as a Stanford student in 1960 when he came back from the military. He found his way back to that community in part through Varda. Varda, of course, was a close friend of Henry Miller. He's the one who introduced Henry Miller to Big Sur. I think one of the other people in the boat is a man by the name of Jack Loeffler, who came out of the beat community, helped Stewart create a multimedia project called American Needs Indians, ultimately settled in the Southwest as an environmental activist, became a very close friend of Edward Abbey's. And he's actually the person who buried Edward Abbey. You can't always trust documents. And one of the things I found is that documents are essential, but they're not enough. And one of the things that Stewart did, after coming back from the Army, one of the first things he did was basically took part in this remarkable experiment that took place over about 4 years, run by the International Foundation for Advanced Study. And they believed that they could prove that there was a connection between LSD and creativity, and Stewart was one of their first subjects. He spent about $500 for this experiment, and they took him through a very intense experience. So this is from Stewart's journal. 2 oral doses of LSD, and then a 3rd dose by injection. Can you imagine that? Now, both Stewart and Jim Fadiman, who was one of the people who helped him as a guide to that, said that that wasn't accurate. Third person, Don Allen, who was also involved, said that they used LSD by injection to break down the very tough subjects. The tough nut to crack was Stewart in this case. They were trying to break his barriers down, apparently. So I was never able to get to the bottom of this, but the documentation is there. This is Stewart on assignment. He was a young photographer on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation in Oregon. He went up there and he came away with a different view of the world. He ran into an Indian culture that was very different than his own, and he took things away that stayed with him through the Whole Earth catalog into today. This is probably the moment that the New Games movement started. Early 60s again, Stewart was working on that multimedia project, American Needs Indians, and he saw these young kids in the Sierras at a California Indian festival playing a kind of game he didn't see in middle-class white culture. There were no gender boundaries, there were no winners, no losers, and it came to fruition about a decade later. This is actually one of my favorite photos of all. It sort of sums up San Francisco in the 50s and 60s in one picture. Stewart's talking to Ken Kesey, who's in the blue jacket. That's the prankster bus further, and Neil Cassidy is leaning out of the bus. And I think the significant thing here is that Cassidy and Brand were bridges between the beat culture of the 50s and the hippie culture of the 60s in different ways. Stewart likes to think of himself as an off-the-bus prankster, and here he was hanging onto the bus, which I enjoyed a lot. I think that's going to the acid test graduation. Bill English is sitting at the terminal with the glasses, and English was Doug Engelbart's lead engineer, chief of engineering for the project that Engelbart did that was shown just across the street here in December of 1968. So sort of the 1,000 best computer scientists in the world learned about interactive computing. And English told me that he had invited Stewart in because of Stewart's experience with the American Needs Indians project. He was looking for someone who knew about multimedia. And of course, Engelbart pioneered the mouse and hypertext, and that technology we use today. In terms of Stewart Brand scholarship, I think this was my best discovery. Reading this reframed the way I look both at the Whole Earth catalog and at Silicon Valley in a really significant way. So imagine 1967, everybody else, all of your friends are heading off to the land to start communes. August of 67, Stewart shows up in Menlo Park. You remember, Silicon Valley wasn't named until 1971, but in the second half of the 60s, all the forces that would create the valley were alive and they were happening everywhere. So Stewart shows up and he says, with the intent to let my technology happen here in Menlo Park. Who had the sense that Silicon Valley was going to happen 3 years later? And Stewart ended up at ground zero. What he was doing, the project he was doing, was an educational technology fair, which failed. The funny thing is about the funding proposal is remarkable. If you read the funding proposal, it reads exactly like the Maker Faire. As a matter of fact, it was supposed to happen at the San Mateo County Fairgrounds. It was just 40 years early. But what I walked away from this journal with is, one, how close he was to Engelbart for the year before he actually was involved in the demo and then started the catalog, and how influential Engelbart was on Stewart during that year. Much more so than I understood. If you read the subtitle of the Whole Earth catalog, it's subtitled Access to Tools. And if you ask Stewart, where did that come from? He'd say, well, I was just channeling Buckminster Fuller. Fuller, of course, said, if you want to change the world, just give someone a tool and teach them how to learn it. But at the same time, he was influenced by Engelbart. And of course, Engelbart at that time was at work on creating the universal tool. And so what I came away realizing, there are a number of books that have come out recently. The zeitgeist on Silicon Valley has gone very rapidly from Silicon Valley being able to do no wrong to Silicon Valley being able to do no right. And two of the books that appeared in 2017 basically go back to Stewart's biography, looking for Silicon Valley's original sin. And when I finished this, it just flipped my perception entirely about the relationship between the catalog and Silicon Valley. In Brandian terms, they basically co-evolved. And what's interesting to me about that is the stuff that Stewart ran into in the late 60s on the Mid-Peninsula and fed into the catalog basically influenced an entire generation of young Americans while Silicon Valley was forming. It was the first thing that came out of Silicon Valley, basically. And so I had to completely turn it on its head. sometimes the internet gets everything wrong, too. That's another thing that probably surprises you. This is Stewart talking at the first Hackers Conference in 1984. This is what the internet says he said. Information wants to be free. As a matter of fact, they got the date wrong. It was in 1984, not the 1960s. And this, of course, is what Stewart actually said. Information wants to be very expensive, and information wants to be free. He was describing a paradox, which, in a sense, channeling Gregory Bateson. And yet, we only heard the second half of what he said. And it, of course, led directly to the open source software movement, and also became the rallying cry for the dot-com era, and led us into this regulatory or non-regulatory morass that we're in today. So thank you. Sander.
Thank you, John. And we're just going to ask a couple questions up here, and then Stewart is going to join us. So I just want to ask a little bit just about maybe your background and your process. And looking through a lot of your work, you mostly don't really write so much profiles or biography work. And so I'm wondering, what made you want to do a biography in this case?
Yeah, so once again, I grew up in Palo Alto. I grew up in the heart of Silicon Valley. I played in the Hewlett household as a child. And Silicon Valley, my first book, What the Dormouse Said, was actually an anti-autobiography in the sense that I left the Valley in 67 and I returned in 77, and there was this thing called Silicon Valley that popped up in the interim. And I've always puzzled about why it happened, where it happened, and when it happened. And that's been a question that's sort of has bugged me for a long time. And of course, Stewart was right in the middle of all that. And so one of the things I should say, I was getting ready to leave the Times in 2016 and got a call from Kevin Kelly. He said, Stewart was thinking about writing an autobiography, but he's decided he doesn't want to. You should write a biography. And I'm about a decade behind Stewart, and in a lot of ways, I've followed him through many of his adventures. And so it was not only a fascinating life, but it played on a lot of the issues that I was interested in.
I realize since you met him around the time of the Hackers Conference, right? Or
I think the first time, yeah, that's a funny thing. That's the first time I remember speaking with Stewart. The first time I have a very clear, I showed up in the truck store as a college student, but I have very few memories of it. It was a remarkable place. People talk about places like Florence or Vienna, and that place in that time was an extraordinary, the community, the counterculture community which surrounded the 3 computer labs was an extraordinary place.
Can you say a little bit about what the truck store was?
So the classic story is Stewart was on this airplane coming back from his father's funeral, and he began to wonder what he could do for his friends who were going back to the communes. And so he sort of hatched this notion of a truck that would take information and tools out to the communes and sell them to them. And he took 2 beta road trips during that summer of '68. And the first thing he realized is his friends on the communes had no money. So that wasn't going to work. and so he pivoted in a classic kind of Silicon Valley way and found the idea of this catalog. And so that, the truck store then became the home base for the catalog. It had all kinds of interesting, mostly books, but it had clothing and tools and all kinds of stuff. And it was kind of a beacon for a while.
Physical instantiation.
Yeah, of the catalog.
And I think the book really exemplifies this, but your slideshow as well, is that Stewart kind of has this like Forrest Gump level of like showing up in all of these places at the right time. That Kennedy shot looks like it's actually from the Forrest Gump movie. If you remember where they edited him into that shot. But this kind of amazing ability of being at a place either, in some cases, 40 years too early, apparently, with one idea, but in some cases just the right amount of early to cause something to happen. And I was wondering if you could comment on that before we have Stewart come up.
Yeah, and I puzzled over that, and I've asked Stewart about that, and Stewart's thought about that. And I think it's a way of looking at the world is the only thing I can sort of surmise is how you could do it. Being able to do something repeatedly, when you do it more than 2 or 3 times, you think there must be a methodology here. And I wasn't able to define the methodology, but it's happened too many times to have been coincidence.
Well, this is a perfect time to have Stewart up, and we can ask him ourselves.
Yeah.
Cover with light behind me.
Here you are once again in the right place at the right time.
Right.
So, Stewart, I want to bring this question back to you. What do you think, what do you attribute this kind of mindset that's allowed you to be there? And then also you seem to kind of leave before it commercializes or something like that. So it's both good luck and bad luck, maybe. I'm not sure.
Something happened at Exeter and Stanford that we haven't quite talked about this, which it's in John's book. I was never dean's list. I was a B student all the way. And one of the things you learn at these elite schools and universities is you are not the sharpest tool in the shed. And that's anyway what I was realizing. And so in the poker game of life, I had a not very good hand. What do? Well, you can bluff, or you can leave the game. And what I sort of did, not only would the fraternities not have me, the eating clubs wouldn't have me. I was so asocial. And so if that's the situation, what do you do? And I think what I realized is if I tried to compete, I would always lose. But when you invent, it's not competition yet.
Yeah.
And so inventing became my mode, and then it's just a question of acquiring a lot of skills that you can apply to starting things. And you go and discover other people are starting things to either help them do that or learn from them how to do it. Yeah. And then the people who start things tend to find each other, the ones who do it well. And that was my gang. Lots of different people at different times. But we hardly ever competed. I mean, I never even bought dope. There was so much floating around. They were all selling dope. I didn't get in that game, but I certainly took it when they handed it to them. So a lot of stuff was free. A lot of stuff was cheap. The great thing about the hippies is even the ones who didn't have to pretended to be poor. I was sort of one of those. I lived in a $20 a month apartment in North Beach, if you can imagine that these days. And you point out a wonderful thing in the book, which I can recommend. From time to time, I would write my mother. He's read all these letters that I wrote my mother from camp on. And my God, what's in there? But part of why I was doing it was at the end of these very informative family letters, I would say, oh, by the way, do you think you could maybe send $100 whenever it's convenient? And she would do that. And so I was just sort of in a trickling way subsidized. And I'll wrap on this. So it meant that I didn't have to get a job.
Yeah.
And the thing that Brian Eno says to art students now routinely is, you're going to go out of here and you can't make money yet, probably, at what you really want to do. And you're going to be tempted to get a job. Please don't do that. Because if you do that, and then you see something or somebody, or you have an idea, or there's an opportunity to go somewhere, you won't be able to act on it. And you need to be able to act on things right away. And so don't have a job. And thanks to my mother and that little subsidy that came along from time to time by request, I was able to not have a job and not have a career. And this is, I think, the floating upstream thing. But I'd like to know from you why you wanted to call the book Floating Upstream.
Oh, well, you're an iconoclast. You do go in different directions. That was one of the things that struck me right away. I mean, I described Stewart as being wealthy in an as-needed way. He was wealthy enough not to get a day job, and I think that really was what you almost did get a day job. I mean, you were coming to Menlo Park in 1967 to look for a job in the business technology world. What would have happened if Dick had gotten you a job?
I would have been fired. I sort of was fired by the Army.
That's true.
Well, this is all a good argument for forgiving student debt, I think. The
Yeah.
Brian Eno principle of this. I think, and also I think it's interesting, this thing about the things that were misattributed to Stewart and these quotes that I've seen now many times. The "Stay hungry, stay foolish" is now attributed to Steve Jobs
yeah.
because he said it, but he was quoting you, or he's quoting the catalog.
But he's the only person who ever quoted it or took it seriously. I learned this, we did a thing together for the Library of Congress. And afterwards, the people who had shot the film said, "Steve would love to have a copy of the catalog that says, 'Stay hungry, stay foolish. Would you sign it?'" And I did that and sent it off. And then a couple of years later, he gave that amazing commencement speech at Stanford. And I sort of wrote to him and basically said, "Steve, you owe me lunch." So I went down and had a lunch with him. And it was great, but I should have asked him what the hell "Stay hungry, stay foolish" meant to him. Because now everybody asks me, it meant so much to Steve Jobs. What does it actually mean? What it meant to him, I have no idea. What do you think?
Well, that's an interesting question of what it meant to Steve. But I mean, the way you described it.
Well, you know a lot better than me.
Well, so I know a lot about the creation of that speech. I mean, Michael Hawley, who's no longer with us, actually helped Steve write that speech, and I think a lot of the sort of the catalog stuff was actually co-created by those two.
Okay.
And so, but in terms
That's
of
not known by people before now. And Michael Hawley really deserves that credit.
yeah.
But
So I mean, I was mostly interested in what it meant to you, because you described the relationship between that open road that was sitting beneath it and the "Stay hungry, stay foolish." It was the idea of a hitchhiker setting out on a road, and they didn't know where they were going, and life was just this open book in front of them.
and someone's eyes must meet the sun. Yeah.
Again, don't get a job. Yeah.
Don't get a job. But I can't tell you when I took. Well, so first of all, there's this bimodal distribution of people who know Stewart. They're the people who grew up in my generation who read the catalog, and then there are people who saw Steve Jobs' commencement address, and then there's this big empty space in between. It's really, but I've tried to count the number of people who've watched that video, and it's in the tens of millions. I'm not quite sure. I don't have a real number because YouTube screws everything up. And
Boy, if I'm going to star in somebody's speech, that's the one. So.
And I think one of the things I really loved. I mean, I've now known Stewart for 40 years. I was falling asleep under tables that he was having meetings at Sausalito and trying to help save the waterfront when I was a little kid.
Art Zone, yeah.
And, but I was so surprised by some of the early stuff that you pulled out. And as you point out, we always have seen Stewart as the leader in almost everything. He was first to everything. But what I never knew was the relationship with his brother, and how that he actually followed his brother to the Army, to logging, right? And then as well as Stanford. How did you pull all that stuff out? Where does those materials
that
from?
came out of our conversation. Stewart, it was strange because he had two brothers, and he had an older brother, and I also talked to Mike, his older brother, who he did follow, and the relationship was largely on Stewart's side. Mike was not as aware of Stewart as Stewart was aware of Mike.
Right.
And Mike was kind of surprised when I told him actually how much you followed him. But I don't completely know why Stewart skipped over his middle brother, because he would have been closer in age. But he really sort of took Mike as his role model. So here's how serendipity comes into the world. One of the really great things that Mike told me is why he ended up at Stanford, which of course is why Stewart ended up at Stanford. So unlike Stewart, Mike was a football star at Exeter, and he was a jock and all of those things. And I think he played football at Stanford too. But
He started to.
But the reason he went to Stanford is he was in the hospital, or he was sick at one point, and he was reading this magazine, and he saw that Stanford had this football coach that had lost all of his games in the season. And they kept the coach. They didn't fire the coach. And so Mike said, "That's the place for me." Which was a great attitude.
Because they didn't fire their coach, like any place that would keep a coach?
They didn't take the sport that seriously.
All right. So he wanted the scholarship at the place that didn't take it seriously.
Yeah.
That's really great. I think some of the stuff that you've brought up, and even I think surprised Stewart with, I'd love for you guys to say a little bit about some of the things that maybe the way some of these things have looped around. I think it was one of the things the Save the Whales movement story, I think, was an interesting one.
You know, Stewart has had forays over time into activism. He sort of, I mean, one of the interesting sort of dichotomies between Stewart and I is that he's got this antipathy to the New Left, and I grew up in the New Left. And so that was an interesting thing that we negotiated.
You're a red diaper baby.
I was a red diaper baby, that's true. But
we didn't have any red diapers in Illinois, I'll tell you.
I mean, one of Stewart's sort of activist ventures was putting a group together to try to create a Woodstock home in Stockholm at this first global environmental conference. He thought he could get 300,000 or 400,000 people in a Woodstock kind of way, and I think he got, what, 800 or 900?
If that.
Yeah, and Stewart was, you know, he was in a tough phase in his life. His marriage was falling apart, and he got there, and he was pretty much a wreck during the whole thing, and basically didn't see that Stockholm conference and the Save the Whales stuff came out of the stuff that he did. And there
the image of that vehicle that was dressed up as the whale.
That's right.
Became this iconic thing.
It was on every newspaper page, front page in the world, and in fact, the Save the Whales treaty pretty much directly came out of that. And so he was involved in that. I mean, he didn't see that at all. Matter of fact, that sort of turned you away from activism at that point.
Yeah, the untold story of the whale in Stockholm was the hog farmers, a bunch of buses based sort of on the pranksters further, and they dressed up a bus as a whale, which is not bad for scale. It was more rectangular than most whales, but it had a tail and stuff like that, and they had tapes. That was the big deal when humpback whale songs were a big deal, and so they had this tape that was going to play a humpback whale song as it paraded through downtown Stockholm. And as usual in prankster and some hog farm things, there was a fuck up, and they couldn't get the tape to work. So they had to persuade everybody marching to sing like whales, which was better.
And you invented the first Burning Man art car as well.
Well, that was another place that Stewart showed up first. I mean, you were on the playa in 1960, 62 or 60, 63. 63, yeah.
Black Rock Desert was and forever will be one of the great places on the planet. It's where you really feel it is a planet.
Yeah, the curvature of the Earth story is.
Yeah.
But actually, that's another great story. I think you found earlier evidence of why haven't we seen the picture of the whole Earth than I think Stewart remembered, right?
Stewart talked about this, how things would bubble for years and perhaps decades. And in this particular case, you know, he tells this story about going up on the roof here in North Beach and on half a tab of acid and sort of wondering about why the Earth was curved and coming down and stairs and starting this project. But when I was reading through the documents, I could see that a lot of those threads were in, I mean, I think my guess was he stumbled across this in one of LBJ's inauguration speeches where he was quoting Carl Sagan about this blue dot. And Stewart, I could see Stewart had outlined that. He'd stumbled across this idea of being able to see the entire Earth at least 2 or 3 years before you stumble across it again.
Well, you know, as a photographer, to have your most famous photograph be one that was taken by other people, it's a little strange. So you can imagine how pleased I am that the cover photograph on John's book is a self-portrait that I actually took in North Beach at the very place where the roof with the LSD was.
I think you mentioned this a little bit in your talk, but I think it's worth kind of talking about it a little bit more, is the amount of source material that you have is kind of staggering. And I mean, and the amount of interviews I know you did. I mean, can you say how many interviews and how many and how you got to how you accessed the emails you did access? And
so it's this was sort of biography was a new research domain for me, and Stewart had been kind enough to keep stuff, and Stanford had curated it, but going through it was completely. So I have a 16 gigabyte file. I digitized everything dutifully, and what I found is at a certain point, string search breaks down as a useful tool. And the other thing, Stewart talked about his correspondence with his mother. I dutifully read all of Stewart's letters. If I had tried to read his mother's letters, I would still be reading because his mother's handwriting was completely illegible. a computer might be able to do it, but I couldn't do it. To decipher one of his mother's letters would take a half an hour.
Right.
It was really quite remarkable.
I don't know if you came across this document. I remember when there was a document when for the Trips Festival anniversary that was a while ago, where there was the budget document for that he submitted saying that the Grateful Dead were going to play. And had booked them, and he had not even talked to them. And then they showed up because they were on the poster, was my understanding of that story.
I think that's
Maybe
true.
you should tell that story. That's my memory of the
Well,
story.
Lois tells that story, but I don't think that in the movie, but I don't think that ever happened. It might have, something like that might have happened with not the Trips Festival, but the later one, whatever it is.
Whatever it is, at San
Which
Francisco
I did
State.
at San Francisco State,
yeah.
and it was uncertain whether Kesey was going to be able to show up or not. And I think I sort of indicated that Pranksters and so on, that world was going to be there.
Yeah.
And I guess the Dead did play.
On the second night.
Yeah.
On Saturday.
And that's when
Well,
I exploded the place with an atomic bomb.
Yeah, on Friday night, Jerry
What I had
Garcia.
was a guy get on the stage and turn on the soundtrack of the newscasters saying that the launch has happened. It's going to hit all of them, and then did a countdown to how long. And people are kind of going, well, this is kind of weird. And I'd wired the place with hidden flashlights. And so when he got to, I'm afraid this is it, folks, and then all these things went off. There was a great big kaboom sound, and all the lights in that part of campus went dark. Kind of a fuck you to the audience.
So the other remarkable thing about the Trips
We're not
Festival,
going to do that here, don't worry.
I mean, Bill Graham was the one who took the most away from the Trips Festival in so many ways. I mean, the day after the Trips Festival, they met at a cafe across from the Fillmore, which was not the Fillmore. And that day, Graham leased the Fillmore. And the first poster at the Fillmore said, with the sights and sounds of the Trips Festival. And so both the San Francisco music scene, and also I think Tom Wolfe said that the Trips Festival was the first time the 10,000 hippies in the Bay Area realized there were 10,000 hippies and had this way of creating a community, and there was a direct line to the Haight-Ashbury.
Yep, I think that's true.
Which of course Stewart missed. I mean, Stewart has been called the Prince of the Hippies, and I think that's just ridiculous. You were a bridge to the hippies, but you were gone by the time the Summer of Love happened. You were down in Menlo Park.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think this is a good point, is that often people associate Stewart with the hippies, but really he was in the beat movement, and then, or how would you describe it? Is that?
Well, it was, quote, silent generation, which was an observation made at Stanford of my students by our faculty, who the previous set of students they'd had were GI Bill folks, the people who'd come back from the Second World War, wanting to get an education. They weren't there to get drunk. Having seen more of the world than most of their teachers, having been through combat in many cases, and they were taking no shit. And so they would, in classes for these teachers, push back. And real discussions about real stuff would occur. And the teachers who didn't hate it loved it. And then we came along and we looked like the most flaccid, kind of pathetic, quiet people they'd seen, because that was the contrast. And so we were called the silent generation. We later fixed that. But it was before the boomers. And so Kesey was a little older than me. I was a little older than most of the hippies. If you want to sort of bracket it, late 60s, 68 catalog and so on would be sort of early hippie. And when Steve Jobs came along and was being influenced by the whole Earth catalog, that was sort of late hippie, and that's sort of that was and both of us went out and tried to make do with communes in the countryside. Both of us got insanely bored and came back to town pretty quickly, which everyone did, but almost everyone. But it was because we did an important thing, which was have these fond fantasies and not get jobs, go out and with not much money, play out our fantasies. and then have our noses rubbed in the mess that it made. Of, there's no free love, there's no free money, there's all this, gardening is hard, domes leak, all this stuff, drugs make you crazy. And so we learned like a good dog that is a mess, don't do that, do other cool stuff. And the hippies had been selling dope to each other, so a lot of us knew how to be businessmen because of that. And here's another important thing. Long hairs picked up each other hitchhiking because nobody else would. And if you were a long hair, you were basically part of the problem as far as America was concerned, except for business people. For reasons I don't know, one of the hippies' sort of ethics was to be honest, tell the damn truth, and don't whisper it. And so we were strangely honest. We would pay bills, when we got them and stuff like that. And business people realized that long hair or not, weird face paint or not, diffraction gratings on the forehead or not, we were actually good customers, good employees, and then soon enough, with our own inventions, good business people. And that's who we became, basically. And I think going through that hippie process, one of the things about living cheap is you get very aware that you get very aware of what you can do with a bit of money. And the reason the demise party, where I put $20,000 in cash on the podium for people to hold in their hands and talk about what everybody should do with it, that was such a zoo. I mean, imagine doing it now with the younger generation with crypto money and Stripe money and all the kinds of, hey, here's $20,000, we have to decide what to do with it. And everybody would just walk out. It's not an interesting amount of money. But back then, the hippies, it was an unimaginable amount of money. They had no sense of how to do group process. The New Left was not good at that, unfortunately, by and large. And the hippies were terrible at it. So, you would argue and not do anything. That's why the education fair didn't happen. And so it was a zoo, but it was an interesting zoo.
But it had a serendipitous effect, too.
Spell it out.
So they spent the entire night trying to decide what to do with the money by consensus, and they failed.
They said it cost Stewart Brand $5,000 to make a really great party and $20,000 to spoil it.
So at the end of the night, at some point, this guy who was an itinerant draft resister by the name of Fred Moore stood up, and he actually burned one of the $2 bills that he had in his pocket. That was all he had to his name. And when people gave up on figuring out what to do with the money, they gave the money to the guy who'd burned the dollar bill. And so Fred Moore, who didn't believe in money, ended up walking away with the money. And the great irony, is Fred was a bit of a hacker, and he was involved in these events that happened monthly, these potlucks at the Portola Institute, at the People's Computer Center. And when they fell apart, he was one of the two people with Gordon French who started the Homebrew Computer Club.
It's a good transition to the next topic, which is...
You can see why people paid attention to him, because the deal was there had to be a vote of who was going to get the money and do the idea that people liked. And Gordon had... he had burned the dollar bill, and he said it's not the money. You just burned half of his money. It's the people. And then he started collecting a list of names and phone numbers. And people realized that here was one guy who actually had a good concept of the real event. This was a bunch of people who could work together, and that it was not the money, and just access their phone numbers. And so then what happened?
Well, ultimately, 24 companies, including Apple, came out of that. And then, it was sort of that... out of the Homebrew Computer Club.
Yeah, exactly.
And Apple was that canonical Silicon Valley company where there was Steve Wozniak, who just wanted to build a computer to show to his friends at the Homebrew Computer Club, and then there was this guy, Steve Jobs, who saw there was a market there, and it was that match that for a long time, I think, was the kind of defining archetype of a Silicon Valley company.
Did when they sold blue boxes, was it Steve Jobs who wanted to sell them and
No,
and
actually it was
Steve
Wozniak
who wanted to call the Pope?
It was Wozniak's mother. She was the one who read that article, and she sent it to her son. And so
story in Esquire about phone freaks.
That's right. The Mysteries of the Little Blue Box. And they set off on a quest to find John Draper. And about 3 weeks later, Draper showed up in their dorm room and taught them how to build these things, which they then sold door to door. And that was the original capital.
Explain why John Draper was called Captain Crunch.
Well, that whistle in the cereal box was tuned to the exact frequency that basically unhooked a Watts extender and let you get a long-distance phone call.
So, in your Cracker Jack or whatever it was, is a thing that gives you free calls anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
How wild was that?
And didn't you find a document recently that showed that, or Stewart maybe found it, that you were talking about phone freaking?
Yeah, that was that photograph I took of before I was a photographer, because I was so pleased of having bought a bunch of resistors across the street at wherever it was. Zach's, no doubt.
Yeah.
And just put them out for free by the phone. And what you did is you took the resistor, put it in the base of the handset, and then found the full piano hinge on the door, touched it, and it was a ground. Zach, you had the dial tone and call anyone.
Nice. And that's actually a good segue, and I want to make sure we bring this up a little bit to the present, and I think the
long now.
Well, not long now yet, but I think you're alternately kind of blamed for all of the wrongs of Silicon Valley and kind of giving credit for some of the birth of these ideas, and especially with the Well, which is a story that I think you get to and you were part of, and I think I'd love for you to tell a little bit about what you thought of the Well as it started, and I'd love to hear what Stewart got out of that.
The Well is the arc of the Well is an interesting story, and Stewart's his creation of the Well and his exit from the Well was interesting to me as well. But I was one of these technology writers at that point. When the Well started, I was just making the transition from Byte magazine, which is very technical, to the San Francisco Examiner. Thank you, Will. Stewart's brilliant marketing move in starting the Well was that he gave free accounts to people like me and Stephen Levy and a bunch of other technology writers.
And to hackers.
And to hackers, that's right. And it created this community, but it also basically gave the Well an out-of-scale reputation. I don't think there were never more than 14,000 members of the Well.
I'd be surprised.
If I had to situate, there was a digital culture that emerged, but the Well was a pretty small part of it, and it wasn't first. I mean, there was... I'm sorry, the Well is still.
Thank you.
There was CompuServe, there was the Source, there was Prodigy, and most importantly, I think if you wanted to situate a digital culture, there was Usenet. All of the Unix data centers around the country were connected, and there was a very kind of libertarian spirit, a hacker spirit in those, and that basically was happening at the same time. There was FidoNet was going on. All of this stuff was happening, and the Well was a big part of it, but it wasn't. The thing that I took away, I called that chapter Anonymity, because Stewart had seen some of the things that we're now recognizing now as problems in this cyberspace metaverse, what do you want to call it, and he tried to design the Well to deal with them, and I think ultimately 6 years later you decided you hadn't solved that problem, and you walked away from it.
What I'd seen is that I learned about the stuff that we did on the Well from a system called EYES, E-I-E-S, I guess. Yeah. And I was on a system with a limited conversation of about 20, 30 people, corporate people, intellectuals, computer people, and we would meet twice a year and then just sort of go through discussing various things. And then in a sense, I was on the faculty of this group. And one of the discussion points that came up is anonymity is important because some people need to be able to get a message out without it coming back to really bite them, because it's an important truth, and power will find them and destroy them. So let's have a little anonymous sub-conversation within these various conversations that we were having on EYES. And it was set up, and within 2 days it had gone completely sociopathic. And what happens is when you have anonymity, people can pretend to be other people, And as this other person then do something really sort of insidey, jokey, and cruel, and then that gets the other people who are also now realizing they're anonymous to be equally cruel back. And it spirals into real viciousness really fast. And so that was why I wanted to be sure that that kind of anonymity was not going to be available on the well. But we did allow people to change their names, and it wound up being easy for them to get separate accounts, and they'd be kicked off the well, and they'd come back as somebody else. And we did not control it. And Facebook, originally it was your Facebook identity that was going to be your digital identity in the world. And then that got lost for them. And you see the downstream. So I think still that you own your own words, you're responsible for your own words. And it's not only that you're responsible for your own words online, it's actually a real you, not a bot, not somebody else pretending to be you. It's actually you. And it's the true names thing that Werner Winger wrote about. I think we're going to need to have that, or at least a channel where that is always really a lot reliable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's pretty much a microcosm of exactly what we're living through now at a macro scale. And so I thought it's interesting how early that lesson was learned, yet not actually learned.
Yeah. The cyberpunk science fiction writers laid this all out for us in the 1980s. What didn't we get about what they were writing?
Yeah, I think people used it as a roadmap instead of a warning.
I blame myself. I mean, I fell for John Perry Barlow's utopianism as much as anybody else did. This was going to be this Socratean abode that was going to be separate from the real world.
Well, there was a lot of people standing behind John, kind of rolling their eyes. He would spin that out.
But I think, and that's worth touching on too. I mean, there's the time. I mean, even the time as long I was getting started in the mid '90s, where, there was the techno optimism was very much part of the your scene and the Long Now founding, and then as that optimism has certainly faded, in some cases turned to absolute terror. How do you feel in your kind of birth of this movement, and then where it's gone, and that?
The pendulum of attention that goes from everything is great about an actually mixed bag to everything is terrible about an actually mixed bag is, I don't know, I guess one of the ways that people catch on, learn that it actually is a mixed bag, because you have to oscillate. But it's a mixed bag from the go, and it's a mixed bag every step of the way. You could say, oh gosh, Facebook is so evil because they did this, that, and the other thing. Facebook is an absolute blessing for most people most of the time. And that reality hasn't changed. There have some issues that are still being sorted out, and they're quite consequential issues, affect presidential elections and things like that. But they do get sorted out, and I suppose the optimism is that you bear down on the problems, you don't solve them right away. The really tough problems do not get solved right away. Climate is in that category, and online behavior, I think, is in that category. There's lots of paradoxes built into it, and you've got to sort your way through them. Gregory Bateson said, he worked with schizophrenics a lot. He said that you will see people who are as schizophrenic as they ever were, but they sort of manage in the world. He said, that's like learning to ride a crazy horse. The problem with the horse is you want it to go left, and instead it goes right and then dumps you off and runs away. But you can figure out the situation of the crazy horse, and people have these neuroses, sometimes with talk therapy, sometimes with drugs, sometimes just with life, figure out how to manage the damn thing and ride the crazy horse. And I think we do that at the social and civilizational and cultural level as well.
Well, I think this is the thing that you point out in the book, and we have a few questions along these lines as well, is that kind of Stewart also knew when to leave in some way, or maybe knowing is the wrong term, but
it's more like,
got bored
why
of
did he
things.
always leave early?
Yeah, but there was this restlessness and even sometimes these failures like the education thing that then in somehow kind of launched into the next thing. So what did you learn in like watching those cycles?
Well, I mean, I think Stewart explained it to me as he had a relatively short attention. So you have a relatively short attention span. You would tend to get bored and move on. That was actually something that worked to your advantage.
Yeah, and the 5-year thing that we talked about, it's sort of a project that is going somewhere. It takes about 5 years to mature. And if you have a sort of a 5-year attention span, which I guess I did, at one point I wrote, when you can do the thing you're doing in your sleep, wake up, go somewhere else. And things would get to that point where you sort of can see what's coming, and oh yeah, here's coming around again. And if invention is what turns you on, you're not getting it anymore from that particular domain, and so you have to go somewhere else. Yeah. And there's back when we had gears and gear shifts, you had to go through neutral between gears. That's kind of true. And so there's a period, Bob Fuller would say that you're somebody and then you're nobody. And that, when you called that chapter anonymity, I thought you were referring to sort of a period when I was nobody. And it's important, I think, that, and Fuller really pointed this out, if you get addicted to being somebody, you will become a caricature of yourself because you'll be picking up on what people think you're famous for. And in order to escape from that, you have to give up on being somebody and be nobody a while. But nobody is a fantastic place to be. It's like the art student who's just out of school and doesn't have a job. They're open to the world. And that's maybe the stay hungry, stay foolish thing, is to relish being a nobody.
I had to, the catalog is often seen in the framing of the counterculture and the Back to Land movement, and I really wanted to take it out of that framing. And I think my experience in working on this project and telling people I was working on it, and the people from my generation, I can't tell you how many times I would say I'm working on a book about the guy who created the whole catalog, and they go, that something that they saw, I ran into this over and over again, something they saw in the catalog, something they stumbled upon in the catalog, sent their life in an orthogonal direction. It just happened too many times. And I think Kevin Kelly has actually sort of figured this out. I mean, the catalog, first of all, information was scarce. And so the catalog was a centralized way to find new things in the world. And to my mind, Steve Jobs called it Google before Google, but I don't think that's quite right. I thought of it as a fantasy amplifier. It would give people, in Kevin's words, give people a way to invent their own life. And it just happened to my entire generation, and it was horizontal. It wasn't limited to one part of society. I mean, in the first 3 years, they sold 3 million copies, and you know where they were. They were in everybody's bathroom or living room, right, all over the country, and they were each read by 5 people. And so it had a huge impact on that generation.
And actually, it's a great segue. We have a question here from the audience. So how did you get the source material for the first catalog?
Say again?
How did you get the source material for the very first catalog?
Oh, God, it was so sketchy. There's a... I discovered a thing called the single copy order form. If you pretend you're a bookstore, you can order a single copy directly from a publisher. And so I started ordering these books that I wanted at the discount. And
book freaking.
And then 1 out of 5, 1 out of 10 would be worth reviewing. So there was actually that problem. As you pointed out, when we were doing it in the garage and I was going through a lot of books, there were some that were so bad I threw them in the wood-burning stove. he burned the book. Listen, these books were worth burning. But it was that kind of thing. And then I asked people I knew, which wasn't that many people, and they would put me onto things like Cuisinart rods, which were a way you could teach math to kids, and the Snuggly baby carrier, and Happy baby food grinder, and just things that people knew about that were actually pretty good. So that first catalog was $5. It was 64 pages. The next one was many more pages, and it was $4. And then we took the price down, and then the pages up until I lost my mind.
But you were brilliant at recruiting a group of section editors who had particular domain interests, and guys like Lloyd Kahn and Jay Baldwin.
I think we're coming to the end here, but I did want to talk a little bit about what doesn't happen in the book, which is the last kind of 20 years.
Oh, yeah.
Or almost 30 years.
Yeah, why did I end?
And actually, there's the biographical movie on Stewart that some of you might have seen when we did the early premiere here at the drive-in movie theater during COVID. But I think that they also stopped kind of at the same place that you stop. And I think I'd love to hear a little bit about
in my
how do you
case,
decide where to stop with
how do you pick a guy who's still doing things and useful things in the world? How do you pick an end point? And what I decided, I was trying to separate biography from journalism. And to my mind, both the Long Now project, which was underway and which I did write a little bit about, and Revive and Restore were two things that I couldn't assess. I mean, in your case, it's going to take 10,000 years, or at least a couple of thousand years. How am I going to pass judgment on it? And Revive and Restore, I think, is a similar thing. And so it was for me, it was kind of a neat moment. And one of the things I think Stewart, felt a little bit uncomfortable about in the book is I end at this meeting in Berkeley where Stewart confronts the environmentalists, and he said that
I would say they confronted me.
That's fair, but he went into the Lion's Den.
Well,
he went to
the
Broward
Lion's
Center.
Den with joy. Yeah.
And it's interesting that my take on it and the film's take on it is different. I gave Stewart the last word because I thought he actually had an interesting response to his old friend Peter Coyote. Stood up and sort of went after Stewart. And Stewart responded.
Idiot savant came up.
I think he was talking in the general sense, not you in particular, but yes, it did come up. And anyway, so it was a point in time that I thought that I could end.
Well, I just want to end this with a thank you. First of all, I want to thank Stewart for being so open to both the movie project and your book project and laying his entire life out in journals. That's a brave thing to do. And for hiring me when I was 25 and to go on this adventure with you. So thank you. And John, for writing this book, it's so amazingly important to have this kind of stuff, especially when we are contemporaneous with someone, to ask, do all the interviews that you did. And I think Kevin Kelly, I loved his comment, is he now wants you to write a biography of every single one of his friends, so that you can finally get to know them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you, John. Thank you.